Hi, in this video I'm to present a paper prepared in context of Law, Ethics and Revelation in Judaism course. This course explored the idea of revelation in Judaism and its reverberation throughout history of Rabbinic Judaism, from ancient times to the present. Included examination of origins of Rabbinic Judaism, study of rabbinic genres of composition, Jewish ritual and practice, as well as similarities and differences between modern Jewish denominations. Course taught by Dr. and Professor Yedida Eisenstat, former Assistant Professor of Humanities at York University, with affiliation to Israel and Golda Kościcki Center for Jewish Studies and Religious Studies and Classic programs. At the present time, Assistant Professor of Religion and Jewish Studies at Colgate University. Education includes history, Hebrew and Jewish studies, religion, culture and values, midrash and scriptural interpretations. Midrash is a literary solidified genre developed over time. A midrashic approach focuses on textual markers. Those could be contradictions, redundancies in meaning or spelling, juxtapositions of passages or verses. Overall, Midrash deals with the examination of the text. To note, one of the Midrashic periods developed into Jewish religious legal or Halakhic nature. Yedida Eisenstat is also an author of the Russia's Midrashic Anthology, the Torah Commentary Re-examined dissertation. Some of the works outside of the academia sphere which could be contemplated upon could be found in Canadian Jewish News, Saving Conservative Judaism, Reviving Community, Not Conservative Judaism, and Jewish Identity in Those Days as Now. Returning to the paper. The topic of this paper is attitudes of Orthodox, Conservative, Reform denominations in Judaism towards organ and tissue donation and transplantation. Attitudes of Orthodox, Conservative, Reform denominations towards organ and tissue donation and transplantation are an establishment of a discourse within their denomination and a result of an ongoing trans-denominational dialogue. Used responsa and transcripts is something an inquiring individual practicing cultivation of deeper understanding of the Jewish legal, that is, Halakhic process, while reflecting on the factors that form into the determination of religious law and in an effort to explain where and how they differ would find easily accessible. Halakhic denominational perspectives. Halakhic denominational perspectives addresses Halakhic reasoning and process of Orthodox, Conservative, Reform denomination, arriving at the overall conclusion for each, inclusive of whether there is an agreement or disagreement within the denomination based on the works and reasoning of the articles, responsa and its authors examined, conclusively to arrive at establishment of general trans-denominational consensus and disagreement in comparing the three. Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox Judaism approaches the issue from two perspectives, from the non-lenient to medical and lenient to medical, whereby it should be considered that not all rabbis are involved in the medical field, possess either formal or literary knowledge of medical and technological matters. Central Halakhic and medically relevant text is by Rabbi Shaul Israeli, implemented non-lenient to medical reasoning introduced through Rabbi Moshe Feinstein and David Feinstein. Medically lenient reasoning introduced as presented by Rabbi Moshe Tendler and Rabbi Dr. Avraham Steinberg. Discourse between Rabbi Moshe Feinstein and Rabbi Moshe Tendler is a well-known classical precedent in the matter of organ donation. It is of initial importance to understand that all perspectives are considered of Leviticus 19:16, which states, "You should not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor," and acknowledge importance for preservation of human life. Included is the Deuteronomy 22:2 relating the restoration of lost property to its owner, and in context concerned with restoration of quality of life. Recurring and basic primary, pikuah nefesh. The saving of human life is above all other laws except three cardinal sins remaining to forfeit one's life: adultery, idolatry, and murder. Whereby, as an example, Sabbath violation is permitted. Directed autopsies for immediate benefit are permitted. Proper burial, dignity of the body, and resurrection are considered. Non-lenient to medical. Proponent of non-lenient to the openly medical perspective is Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Reasoning and process made in accordance to classical and stringently Halakhic understanding of the breath of life within a human and the end of life upon ceasing of breathing and limb motion. Rabbi David Feinstein reinforced his father's views once asked of them. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein rejected medical position, and I'm quoting, "Cessation of brain function isn't death, since as long as one is breathing, he is alive. Rather, the cessation of brain function is what causes death, since the patient will stop breathing, and it is possible that since he is still alive, there are types of drugs, either those that are known to man or those as yet unknown that would cause the brain to function again. Complication arises due to the need for preservation of the body, where a ventilator is used. Simultaneously, individual is as much as decapitated. Decapitation, in the words of Rambam, mentioned in Mishneh Torah, Laws of the Impurity of the Dead 1:15. Due to the ventilator, oxygen is provided, but irrelevant to breathing. Unpreserved, the body will become incapable to fulfill the organ donation requirements. Therefore, it is clear that one who kills such an individual is a murderer and liable for capital punishment, for neither the Talmud nor the postscript mention that indications of life are found in the brain, and it is impossible to say nature has changed, for even in the times of sages, the brain worked as it does now, and all human life depended on it, and even so one wasn't considered dead upon cessation of brain function. So it's clear that the same is true in our time, which is contradicted by Rabbi Dr. Tendler in the lenient to medical. Continued Feinstein's reasoning. Life is in the organs, not easily detectable, nostrils, where the breath of life is visible in the larger moving organs or apparent in heartbeat or abdomen. Existent is the prior reminder of Genesis 7:22, for surely everyone agrees that the primary manifestation of life that we see is nasal activity, and the primary manifestation of life that gives strength to all the limbs in the heart and the brain, which upon clarification by Rabbi Dr. Tendler is defined as cardiopulmonary death. The heart stopped, the breathing stopped, the Hevra Kaddish came in with a feather, held the feather to the nose. If the feather didn't waft in the breeze, The man was dead, he says, whereby to continue into mention of medical technology as opposed to the feather. Technological medical advances, whenever considered, need to be taken into Halakhic account and into responsible religious accountability for reasoning, since Rabbi Shaul Israeli's reminder through Mishnah Avot, the world is supported by three things: by Torah, by service to God, and by kindness. Service means that when a person has developed and grown in the way he wishes, and his determination has, with divine help, achieved success, he should remember his Creator. He should remember that it is his Creator who had granted him his existence, his talents and abilities, his effort, his will, and his energy. Let a clever man not praise himself for his cleverness, nor a strong man praise himself for his strength, according to Jeremiah 9:22. To realize that all is a divine gift is the essence of service, which gives value and meaning, justification and direction to personal development. Israeli, page 384. Continuing into kindness, a man should not live just for himself, but also for others. Lenient to medical. In a medical spectrum, a legitimate question arises. How is the breath defined when respiratory function preserved by machine? Ventilator, which merely means to provide oxygen to preserve the body. Rabbi Dr. Moshe Tendler and Rabbi Dr. Abraham Steinberg readdressed the question with consideration of brainstem death. Controversial definition of death mentioned by Rabbi Dr. Moshe Tendler as decisively ignored by some. That was one of the dramatic signs that the issue had become an agenda, not a halacha, he says, and the agenda was to fight the brainstem death definition. Rabbi Dr. Moshe Tendler continues halachic reasoning through revisiting brainstem death definition in accordance with Rashi's commentary on the Gemara Yuma Daf Hai, page 86. The language of Rashi is Imhu shohev kemes, if he is lying there as if he is dead, which means no motion, no response to stimuli, which essentially is the protocol for determining brainstem death, before the final test, which is known as the apnea test, or the test to determine whether he can breathe autonomically or not. Rashi warns of initial determining. Rabbi Tendler continues that the person looks like he is dead, meaning there is no brain activity, and then you determine for sure that he is dead by checking the nostril. Examination of the chotam, nostril, relates to the biblical verse Vaypach be'apo nishmas ruach chaim, and God breathed into his nostrils the life, breath. And I'm not sure that I'm pronouncing the Hebrew version with the greatest accuracy. Nonetheless, and hence we know that respiratory death is the final indicia of death. The man was dead long before. The man was dead long time before that. It's not this determination that declares him dead. Rabbi Tendler reminds of misconceptions arising from only later understanding of circulatory system and its relation to the respiratory mechanism, therefore ruling out the Hacham Tzvi, cited by many, establishing life dependency upon the heart. Since the heart warms the air before it goes to the lungs, therefore the heart has to stop beating because the man is still breathing through his heart. Furthermore, life depends upon the heart, and if the heart is beating, the man is alive. False dependency upon the heart due to inaccurate understanding of function of the heart and the function of the lungs. Heart is a circulatory system organ. Only the lungs fulfill the respiratory function. Placement of the heart and the lungs into respiratory category is inaccurate and misleading from biological reality. Rabbi Tendler reinforces comprehension through cardiopulmonary resuscitation, known as the CPR, of the heart, whereby individual had not died. Death is to occur after oxygen does not reach the brain. Individual is then pronounced dead. Therefore, Rabbi Tendler concludes with consideration of all the above. There never was any definition of death other than the death of those cells of the brain that control respiration. Until those cells die, he says, a person can be kept alive using standard cardiopulmonary resuscitation, pacemakers, etc., etc. But once the heart had stopped long enough for anoxia to set into the brain, that's when the heart dies. The heart dies, the lungs die, the legs die, the hands die. That's when the individual is dead. So the true definition of death at all times today and when God made man was brainstem death. Death occurs when the brainstem dies. Nonetheless, according to Rabbi Dr. Avraham Steinberg, Halakhic reasoning repeats presented above. However, Rabbi Steinberg introduces considerations of the Chief Rabbinate of Israel asked by Ministry of Health for the Halakhic opinion concerning transplantation once it became a possibility in Israel. Unanimous conclusion of the specially appointed Chief Rabbinate Committee of Rabbis and Physicians, cessation of breathing in an irreversible fashion that can be verified objectively is the moment of death, and hence a person can become an organ donor even though his heart is still beating. The Chief Rabbinate's decision was that total irreversible cessation of breathing is the moment of death for all purposes. This can be established by brain death criteria so that one can be sure that the entire brain, including the brainstem, is dead and non-functioning and will never resume functioning, and therefore there will never be independent spontaneous breathing, and therefore the person is dead. Decisive Halakhic reasoning based on the Sugya in Yuma, which establishes the only criterion to define the moment of death, the cessation of breathing. Let me show an illustration to enhance the understanding of the matter. So this is something which is a human brain looks like. Once this part is non-functioning, that would be a locked-in syndrome here, and the person still can breathe independently. However, once this part right here becomes issue, that would be a brainstem death, and the person would require assistance breathing. So the person is no longer breathing independently. Once the entire area that's brain at death, and the individual is no longer breathing independently and considered dead. inclusively of the entire brain. Let's continue. Clarified and reiterated, and I'm quoting, only Rashi and the Mary have the Gerza of the dissenting opinion, but one should take into account that the understanding of the function of the heart in those days was as the ancients understood that the heart is pumping air and not blood. And actually the lungs are only a cooling mechanism of the heart, and the major respiratory function is through the heart. Continued to conclude, in other words, even according to the understanding that the dissenting opinion looks into the heart, it is another way to look into respiration. So that actually the Sugya tells us that all opinions go according to respiration. It is only where you can look to check better the functioning respiration. Chief rabbinite's decision, as Rabbi Dr. Steinberg mentions, was independent. Nonetheless, also relied on Rav Moshe Feinstein's understanding, making mention of a response from Rav Feinstein, whose position is complicated due to three different responsa on the matter of death and transplantation. Nonetheless, Rav Moshe Feinstein relied only on breathing, which Rav David Feinstein confirmed. Furthermore, understood and explained by Rav Moshe Tendler, preserved or autonomous respiratory function and reflexes are important to understand and understood by Rav Moshe Feinstein once the medical procedures were visually presented and introduced inaccuracies within ancient understanding. Concern with living donor. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein and Rabbi Dr. Moshe Tendler, classical Halakhic and medical precedent, provides clear definition of death and pikuah nefesh. The saving of human life above all other laws except three cardinal sins which remain, for which one must forfeit one's life: adultery, idolatry, and murder. Concern with the living organ donation remains. Rabbi Dr. Steinberg mentions on the matter of undergoing suffering and pain, circumcision, with consideration of health when a delay is permissible, and Yom Kippur with consideration of health when exceptions are permissible. Nonetheless, definitive explanation is in the responsa by Rabbi Shaul Israeli. Rescuer is obliged to take all necessary trouble, including any physical effort, even a certain risk of danger, but is under no obligation to undergo pain and suffering, or to donate from his body any organ or tissue, such as kidney, which does not regenerate in the body of the donor, even though the danger is, it is claimed, not great. Israeli, page 386. Risk exceeding 50-50 of endangering own life to rescue another is considered an act hasid shota, intentioned stupidity. Rabbi Israeli details, nobody may save his own life at the expense of someone else's, since nobody knows whose life is worth more in God's eyes. Radbaz deduces the converse, that nobody is obliged, and possibly nobody is even allowed, to give his own life to save that of someone else. Donation to help another is a mitzvah. Donation of resources regenerated within the body, such as of blood or bone marrow, while no halakhic obligation, should be encouraged, and there is a moral obligation. Overall conclusion: disagreement was present, misunderstandings can still arise. However, there is a consensus within the denomination. Adequate reading and examination of the discourse provides clear understanding. Misunderstandings impact to be considered in context of its extent on the actual organ and tissue donations. Inclusively, there is a need to remain mindful of anachronism of some non-medical considerations. Conservative Judaism. Representative of conservative Judaism are responsa by Rabbi Joseph Prauser. First, lengthier paper, Hesed or Chuyev, the obligation to preserve life and the question of post-mortem organ donation, approved by the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, which is CJLS. On December 1995, voted 14 in favor and 7 opposed. The Committee of Jewish Law and Standards of the Rabbinical Assembly provides guidance in matters of halacha for the conservative movement. The individual rabbi, however, is the authority for the interpretation and application of all matters of halacha. Second, dating to spring 1997, condensed version from the United Synagogue Review, adopted to provide concise and general guidance on the matter of the mitzvah of organ donation. Obligation. Rabbi Joseph Prauser opens with an inquiry. What is the halakhic status of post-mortem organ and tissue donation? Continuing into examination of preservation of human life as obligatory. Life-related prohibition is introduced to have been reformulated into positive prescription obligation. Referring to the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 73a, Rabbi Prauser narrates, by relating the duty to intervene in life-threatening situations to the commandment, Deuteronomy 22:1, regarding restoration of lost property, every individual, insofar as he is able, is obligated to restore the health of a fellow man, no less that he is obligated to restore his property. Mentioning codification as presented by Maimonides, Maimonides Hilchot Rotzeh Shmirat Nefesh 114, not even the ability to save the life in peril relieves one of, not even the inability to save the life in peril relieves one of this obligation, reinforced through Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 73a, Rashi. In addition, similar to the mentioned and discussed matters of religious obligations and considerations, mandate to preserve life, pikuah nefesh, takes precedence. According to Rabbi Prauser's responsa of the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, 1991 to 2000. Exceptions are prohibitions against murder, sexual immorality, and adultery. Are the only ones during normal circumstances. Greater stringency during times of religious persecution, extending the requirements of martyrdom even to minor religious practices. Yeridea 137.1. The only exceptions, further elaborated according to Babylonian Talmud Sanhedrin 74a and Yoma 82a, let him die and not transgress. Expense of Sabbath observance is unambiguous to the extent a noteworthy expression of this zeal. Oral Chaim 328.2 is the recommendation directed at Israeli society in Sefer Shemirat Shabbat Kehilchata, that when it becomes necessary to drive an ambulance on the Sabbath observant Jews do the driving. Browser, page 177. Rabbi Browser continues to explain the concern with desecration of the body as by disfigurement, deriving benefit from a dead body and delaying burial. Collective term for this concerns kavod hamet, dignity of the dead. The matter is clear, supported by the responsum of former Israeli chief rabbi Esser Yehuda Unterman. And I'm quoting, since these procedures constitute preservation of life, there is no difficulty. After all, weighty Torah prohibitions are set aside for the preservation of life. Hence, such surgical procedures conducted to save a life are absolutely permitted. Rabbi Ephraim Oshri and Rabbi Theodore Friedman follow in agreement. This addresses 2 out of 3 concerns with regard to delay of burial. In those few rare cases where burial is delayed, we should rely on Rabbi Unterman's general approach. Preservation of life takes precedence, and the prohibition, halanat hamet, delaying burial, is likewise suspended, explains Browser on page 178. Furthermore, on the matter of autopsy, a demonstrable need for information required to avert immediate danger to a specific human life is necessary to render autopsy permissible. In the absence of such a need, autopsy remains prohibited. Indeed, Rabbi Unterman suggests organ donation as a desirable recourse when civil authorities mandate autopsies which would otherwise be halakhically objectable. In cases where an autopsy, one otherwise not in conformity with Jewish law, is performed in accordance with the demands of civil law, as part of a criminal investigation or the like, it may no longer be considered a desecration, nivul. If excised tissue is used for healing. To summarize, the preservation and healing elements are made distinct and clear conditions. They are prescriptive to the initial essence and nature of the obligation derived from Deuteronomy 22:1. Nonetheless, as Rabbi Unterman indicates, however, fulfillment of this condition remains considerably more difficult to establish in regard to autopsy, the benefits of which are generally far less direct and immediate. Autopsy thus remains prohibited unless it is deemed necessary for saving the life of a patient present before us. Rabbi Browser includes clarification with regard to the immediate issue of post-mortem fulfillment of an obligation, that while the dead are not bound by the Jewish law, objections are mere semantics. The consent for organ donation is given prior to one's death or by surviving responsible relatives. The deceased is the means by which pikuah nefesh is achieved. The act of consent while alive or the consent of survivors constitutes the fulfillment of the mitzvah itself. Mitzvah. Mitzvah contains a double form, relation to either of the 613 mitzvot, commandments, while could refer to good or moral deeds, which is an example of metonymy, a double form hereby used to convey meaning. Mitzvah and obligation are implemented interchangeably. Predominant meaning of mitzvah is separate of a concise obligatory nature. Donations of organs or tissue by a living donor is not an obligation. It is a good deed when reasonably considered of no or sufficiently minor risk to the living donor. Rabbi Browser reminds of shortage of cadaver organs as means of placing at risk the living, who, especially in cases of emotionally related donor, parental or spousal relations, would become prospective living donors. Continue. The life-saving impact of organ donation reaches far beyond the sizable number of potential recipients and provides an example. It is a desperate attempt to in a desperate attempt to save the life of a 9-year-old Minnesota girl whose lungs had failed. Doctors first transplanted part of her father's lung, and when that was not enough, tried to transplant part of her mother's lung. While still on the operating table, the girl, Alyssa Plum, died. Concludes, prospective living donors as well as recipients are thus needlessly placed at mortal risk by the shortage of cadaver organs. Rabbi Browser reminds in 1987 a renowned surgeon who pioneered liver transplants to announce to no longer perform transplants from living donors. The death of a single, well-motivated and completely healthy living donor almost stops the clock worldwide. The most compelling argument against living donation is that it is not completely safe for the donor. The distinction between obligation and mitzvah. The risk is absent in post-mortem donation. With the absence of risk as a mitigating factor, post-mortem organ donation is logically rendered obligatory. With regard to the living donors, Rabbi Jacobowitz thus rules that while the gift of blood constitutes a religious obligation, it cannot be enforced, since it may entail some risk for the donor. Similarly, he views higher risk living donation of organs as acts of supreme charity, but not as an obligation. Rabbi Browser reinforces only with time and experience to transplant operations become sufficiently dependable to constitute clear pikuah nefesh, whereby success implies restoration of the recipient's quality of life and normal life expectancy. Determination of death is prediscussed, Halakhic and medical reasoning inclusively. Rabbi Prauser similarly concerned to concisely address the matter, concluding determination of death. Greater familiarity with the practice of transplantation, as well as broader medical and rabbinic literature on determination of death and brain death, have largely eliminated this concern. Prevalent premodern fears of false death are no longer compelling. The final moments of the donor's life are safeguarded by requirements that two physicians certify death, and that these physicians not be involved in the transplant procedure. Definition for the moment of death is of clear halakhic, legal, moral, ethical concern, and is summarized in 1975 writing by Rabbi Jacobowitz. The question of defining the moment of death with precision has been rendered both more difficult and more critically acute by the demand for viable cadaver organs for transplant purposes. The lapse of only a few minutes may spell the difference between success and failure in such operations. On the other hand, the premature removal of organs from the dying may hasten death and constitute murder. The dignity of the dead is expressed inexcusable for rabbinic reluctance to mandate post-mortem organ donation. With respect to the man created in the image of God and possesses dignity and value, Rabbi Dorf on the matter: if the body is honored to the extent that it is in Judaism, even in death, one can easily understand how many Jews would hesitate to mutilate it or allow one's own body to be mutilated, even when it is for the noble purpose of helping to save someone else's life. Rabbi Prauser clarifies the sensitive efforts to persuade rather than coerce, which is irrelevant since has no implication that life-saving action is elective. In addition, with regard to diligence and care shown for the body of the deceased, Rabbi David Golinkin, it is not merely permissible for a Jew to bequeath his organs for transplantation following his death. It is a mitzvah for him to do so in order to save one life or several lives. Prauser, page 184. Under emotional and psychological consideration, Rabbi Prauser provides additional perception of the mitzvah through Rabbi Untermann's offering of reassurance to donors' families. It is a great merit to the deceased and gratifying to his soul that so great mitzvah is fulfilled with his body. One must not underestimate this consideration. Overall conclusion. Overall, conservative Judaism is in agreement. Furthermore, can, and in part as briefly introduced in Rabbi Prauser's Determination of Death, can rely on the Orthodox Halakhic denominational perspective discussed, perhaps from further reading of the responsa experiences some leniency towards greater consideration for eye transplantation, considerate of blindness as potentially pikuah nefesh, as used for healing, Orthodox, as introduced by Rabbi Dr. Moshe Tendler, might not be as lenient. However, since it is not direct focus of this paper, matter remains open for separate consideration. Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism and Reform Halakhic reasoning examined based on Central Conference of American Rabbis, shortened as CCAR. Responsa. Bequeathing. Reform responsa of Central Conference of American Rabbis reasons from what is introduced as the basic question of permissibility of autopsy in Jewish law. The response is concise, finding no initial law or regulation expressly forbidding the practice of autopsy. Derives from the Bible, Talmud, and the Shulchan Aruch. 45 years ago, Dr. Jacob Lauterbach wrote a classic responsum for the CCAR. Autopsy considered permitted by the great 18th, 19th century authorities, with one condition: only when there is in the immediate vicinity a patient of whom the doctor says he may well be benefited by what will be learned from the autopsy of the dead person. Nonetheless, whatever a doctor may learn from autopsy in one city can be known almost at once in any other city. And so we may well say that patients who might be benefited by the autopsy are always present. Overall stated, there are simply no law in classic sources to exemplify, to explicitly forbid autopsy. Central Conference of American Rabbis does not consider Dr. Lauterbach's statement outdated due to dating back 45 years ago, since finds its manifestation correct. Responsa considers historic elements of the period between the two world wars and the increased anti-Semitism in medical schools of Eastern and Central Europe. Involves medical schools mentioned in the responsum by Eliezer Spiro, questioning the legitimacy of medical inquiry. Traditional law is taken to the objection by Jacob Ettlinger, a rabbi of Altona, Hamburg, 1798 to 1871, where a case of a deceased mother and cesarean operation to save child's life is provided, earlier mentioning no harm to Judaism if there were no Jewish men who would not become doctors, which would, under a critical consideration, reduce knowledge of biology and medicine within the Jewish sphere. With consideration for mutilation and shameful handling of the body, visible mutilation of the brought up to question, as a child can be removed in mentioned manner, so can the internal organs be removed. According to Jacob Ettinger, this would not be constituted as nivul or shameful handling. Central Conference of American Rabbis places autopsy as primary problem. With consideration of the above, Reform Judaism, CCAR responsa, since a man has a right to dispense, if he wishes, with any honors or dignities to which he might be entitled. However, there are scholars who raise objection. Moses Schick, in response Yedida, denying that a man has a right to dispense of his own body, then no arrangement for autopsy of their own bodies can be made. Burial without a delay is another consideration. Continued. However, even this objection is not completely decisive. If these organs taken from these bodies are transplanted into the bodies of living patients, they become part of these living bodies and cease to be in the category of parts of a body which by law must be buried. Paragraph 11. Expression is assigned to Moses Feinstein of New York Orthodox Judaism Authority. Then the concern is with the preservation of separated organs, forbiddingly delay in burial of parts of the body with no recipient immediately available. According to Rashi, once body is placed into a coffin, it constitutes burial. Contradicted by opinion of Rashi's grandson, when preserved organs are later used, the organs become part of another body, requiring no burial, since from that point on are part of another living being, concluding not in a shameful handling of the body and organs, decisively not liable to the laws of burial. Until that time they are hermeutically sealed, which may be considered equivalent to burial. Paragraph 13. Cremation. According to the Central Conference of American Rabbis, responsa, mourning for the cremated, question is presumed halakhically undecided and open. CCAR reform decided on the practice which omits no ritual in the case of cremation. Ashes buried in cemetery without question, full mourning should be observed. The most extreme opinion is by Rabbi Meir Lerner, published in the book Chaya Olam in Berlin, 1904. During the spread of practice of cremation in Germany among certain circles of Jewry, surveyed opinions of leading Orthodox rabbis throughout Eastern Europe responded predominantly in the negative, declining burial of ashes in the Jewish cemetery, and excluded mourning for the sinners of the Jewish ritual and morality and belief. Rabbi Lerner concluded in his book, cremation, he said, is absolutely forbidden. The ashes may not be buried in the Jewish cemetery, and people who provide for the cremation of their bodies are undoubtedly complete sinners with regard to Jewish ritual and morality and belief. Therefore, no mourning at all should be made for them. Something to consider, though, is burial, from the contemporary perspective, is costly. While burial must take place in some form, not everyone can afford the proper burial, or rather a burial of body, not the ashes. So in this case, perhaps cremation, if it's the only way accessible, if it's the only means of burial, I guess that's something to think about. And nonetheless, to continue, Michael Heiger opposes practice of cremation since it is contrary to established Jewish custom. I find this an important element. However, in Halachas Agados mentions absolute objection to the cremation as not completely justified according to the halacha, but what's considered here is the element of customs. While Orthodox authorities would not openly permit cremation, primary concern is the dignity of the deceased. Burning of the body to disgrace remains forbidden, but would be potentially permitted when meant for the honor of the deceased. Something to consider is whether a burning of the body customary honor. So how much leniency is to individual decision, what are the consequences, how the does it meet customary practices halfway? Does it shift into absolutely direction of its own? Furthermore, Orthodox authorities Benamoze of Leghorn and David Hoffman of Berlin would permit burial of the ashes in the Jewish cemetery. Central Conference of American Rabbis considers cases when deceased explicitly wishes on a not the regular funeral ritual, non-customary. The wishes must be acceded due to funeral oration is considered to be an act of homage or honor to the deceased, and the man, if so wishes, may dispense with such honors. Paragraph 3. Mourning for the cremated is initially doubted, since the question arises whether the survivors may dispense with the mourning ritual. Shiva cannot be dispensed by the deceased, since a religious duty incumbent upon the survivors and beyond the rights to prohibit and non-disputable wishes of the deceased. The responsa of Jacob Weil in the recent Reform Responsa, page 111, the Shulchan Aruch, Yoredea 344:10, Joseph Cairo states that if a man asks that no eulogy be made for him, we obey his request. To which Isserles adds that if, however, he asks that the 37 days mourning be omitted, we do not obey his request. Overall conclusion. Overall, Reform Judaism is in agreement, could potentially be considered more lenient and granting greater scope of permissions of individual decision than the Orthodox and conservative, due to allowing the answerers to remain more open and undecided. Conclusion. Orthodox, conservative, Reform are in consensus on the matter of organ and tissue donation and transplantation, determination of death, as well as the dignity of the dead. Nonetheless, Reform is not as explicit on the derived by Rabbi Shaul Israeli from the Mishnah Avot, whereby the world is supported by three things: by Torah, by service to God, and by kindness. Obligation and mitzvah, introduced by Rabbi Joseph Prauser, inclusively, do not come through of primary concern in Reform, where approach and reasoning do differ. However, consideration of permissibility for organ and tissue donation remains in minor disagreement with the Orthodox or conservative. Thank you for watching. Works implemented and cited will appear right at the end of this video.